Comic books have become more of a cultural phenomenon in recent years, partly due to superheroes dominating the box office and pop culture. But while creators of some of the most popular comic books have become household names, there's countless other artists who have been largely forgotten despite their unique styles and their contribution to the comic book industry. From L.B. Cole, who revolutionized comic book covers with his bold use of primary colors, to Matt Baker, who is the first African American to find success within the comic book industry, and many, many others. Here is 10 forgotten comic book artists. L.B. Cole. Over the years, L.B. Cole has gained a new popularity with today's collectors, mostly due to his bold, distinct covers and use of primary colors that draw people in. Leonard Brant Cole was born in 1918. At the age of 12, after completing 8th grade, he decided not to go back to school and instead joined the workforce. He got a job at his grandfather's cigar factory, and that is where he got the interest in becoming an artist. He left his grandfather's cigar factory and started to work as a commercial artist. Due to his training in design and advertising, it served him very well for making comic book covers, as they resembled more of a poster advertisement than comic books. In 1943, he got a job working for Louis Goodman, whose studio provided art for various publishers, including DC, Quality Comics, and many, many more. During World War II, Cole could not pass the physical exam, so he was not drafted. During this time, the publishing industry was struggling to fill the void of lost talent, which meant L.B. Cole became increasingly very productive. In 1949, Novelty Press sold its characters and rights to L.B. Cole, who was actually the cover artist at the time for their Blue Bolt comic. Using his new assets, he started Star Publications in 1949. Like many publishers during this time, the Comics Code Authority censorship plus the growing popularity of TV, this led to many publishers closing down. Star Publications closed down in 1955. The next couple years he worked on Classic Illustrated Junior comics, and in the early 1960s he was the art director and editor for Dell Comics. From about the mid-60s through the 1970s, L.B. Cole moved away from comics and created instructional material and audio visuals for university films. During the 1980s, as the comic book community began to grow, he started selling recreations of his famous covers as commissions. He ended up dying of a heart attack in 1995. Matt Baker. He is best known for his work on romance comics as well as early books of heroines. The way he drew the female form was far above anything else that existed in comic books. He was born in 1921 and is the first African American artist to find success within the comic book industry. After not being drafted into the military due to a heart condition, he tried to get a job at Eisner and Iger's art studio. Iger said that when Baker came into his studio, all he had in his portfolio was a single colored sketch. He thought the sketched woman was the most beautiful and hired Baker on the spot. Baker's first work was a 12-page story in Jumbo Comics 69 in 1944. During this time, much of his work was drawing the female figures for other artists. He is best known for his redesign of the Phantom Lady, which premiered in issue 13 in 1947. During the Comic Code Authority trials, Dr. Frederick Wortham used his art from the cover of Phantom Lady 17 as the main focal point to get comic books banned. Around this time, he also created the first ever black superhero, Vuda. Shortly after, the Comics Code came into effect, which made most comic publishers go out of business. During this time, Baker started focusing mostly on drawing romance comics, as this is what was the hot seller at the time. In the mid-1950s, he started to freelance for Atlas Comics, which was Marvel Comics' name during this time. He mostly did romance and Western comics. He ended up dying of a heart attack at the age of 37 in August of 1959. His last confirmed work was 6 pages in My Own Romance number 73, which was published in 1960 after his death. Jack Cole. With his offbeat sense of humor and cartoony style, Cole found great success with his own created Plastic Man and working for Playboy magazine in its early years. He was born in 1914. After graduating high school, he tried to get a job as an illustrator for magazines and newspapers. After a year, he finally got a job drawing for one of the first comic book packers, Harry A. Chesler, who would supply comic book publishers with art for their comic books, which was a new up-and-coming form of medium at this point. His first assignment was to draw for Centaur Publications, in which he drew TNT Todd of the FBI and Little Dynamite. In 1939, he got hired by Lev Gleason Publications as an editor as well as an artist. His first job was to revamp their brand new character, Daredevil. Another character he worked on was for MLJ's The Comet in Pep Comics. The Comet became the first superhero to be killed and was replaced by the Hangman. In 1940, he was hired by Quality Comics and mainly worked as a ghost artist for Will Eisner's Spirits comics. After creating many characters that never would become a hit, by 1941 he created his first character that became a huge success. In Police Comics #1, as a backup story, he created Plastic Man. Although not the first stretching superhero, that goes to Timely's comics Flexo the Rubber Man. Plastic Man became an instant success. He ended up taking over Police Comics entirely by issue 5. After a while, Cole would just use ghostwriters and artists to produce the Plastic Man comics, but by 1956 the comic book landscape had changed and Plastic Man was canceled. But by this time, Cole had slowly been leaving the comic book industry. He was more focused on drawing risque, good girl art cartoons for Playboy, as well as having a successful full newspaper strip, Betsy and Me. His first art for Playboy appeared in the 5th issue. He would draw a cartoon for every issue until his death. On August 13, 1958, Cole got into a Chevy station wagon and shot himself in the head. Before his death, he mailed a note to his ex-wife, who said it was too personal and sad to reveal. He also sent a note to his boss and friend, Hugh Hefner. It read, "Dear Hef, when you read this, I shall be dead. I cannot go on living with myself and hurting those dear to me. What I do has nothing to do with you. The reason why he did what he did will continue to be a great mystery, as he was becoming more and more successful with his Playboy cartoons and newspaper comic strip." Alex Schoenberg. Born in Puerto Rico as Alejandro Schoenberg in 1905, by the age of 18, he began working with his 3 brothers as a commercial artist. In 1928, he parted ways with his brothers and started working with National Screen Service, creating lantern slides and working on movie trailers. During the 1930s, he also freelanced with Better Productions, producing interior line art for Thrilling Wonder Stories and other pulp magazines. In the 1940s, he began to freelance for Timely Comics, which was the name of Marvel Comics back then. He was one of the main artists who drew Captain America, Submariner, and the Human Torch. He would draw most of Timely's covers, but his first work was Daring Mystery Comics #1 and Marvel Mysteries Comics #3, both cover dated January 1940. Later, he began to provide covers for Pine Publications, where he would draw on such titles as Exciting Comics, Black Terror, America's Best Comics, and The Fighting Yank. In the early 1950s, he left comics and spent the remainder of his career on covers and illustrations for science fiction magazines, astrology publications, and books. In 1977, he did the cover for Invaders Annual #1. Shortly after he retired from illustration, he retired in Oregon, where he died in 1998 at the age of 92. Lou Fine was born in 1914. He contracted polio in his early teens, and his left leg became crippled due to the disease. Early on, he developed a talent for art and went to study at the Grand Central Art School. In 1938, like many artists at the time, he found work at Eisner and Iger, an art studio that would supply complete comics to publishers. His first published work was a strip, Wilton of the West, in Jumbo Comics #3 from 1938. In his early years, he would often use different pseudonyms, usually to make it appear that the company he worked for has more artists working at the studio. Through the early 1940s, Lou Fine became particularly a prominent cover artist, drawing characters such as Blue Beetle, The Flame, Doll Man, The Ray, Uncle Sam, and many, many more. He ended up leaving comics in 1944 and started working in newspapers by drawing Sunday advertisement comics. He ended up starting his own advertising company, but would occasionally still draw comic strips. In 1971, at the age of 56, he was found dead in his studio. He died of a heart attack. Joe Simon and Jack Kirby have called Lou Fine their favorite artist. In fact, Jack Kirby credited Fine to be the first comic artist to draw a line of saliva running between the upper and lower teeth of a character's open mouth, something Kirby would often use. C.C. Beck. Most well known for his work on Captain Marvel, which is now known as Shazam, Charles Clarence Beck, or known as C.C. Beck, was born in 1910. After his studies, he got a job at Fawcett Comics, illustrating for their humor pulp magazine in 1933. By 1939, he was tasked with designing a character called Captain Thunder. Due to copyright reasons, they could not use the comic book Captain Thunder, so the character first appeared in Whiz Comics number 2. Because of an error, it should have been Whiz Comics number 1. In all of his years on Captain Marvel, he never got to write any stories, except for one story in Whiz Comics 22 titled Captain Marvel and the Temple of Itzoluthi. Due to the popularity of Captain Marvel, in 1941, Beck opened his own studio, where he would draw Captain Marvel, Spy Smasher, and Ibis the Invincible as well. Things went so well that in 1944 he opened up a second studio, but in 1953 he had to close both studios due to lagging sales and the copyright infringement lawsuit against Captain Marvel. In 1951, DC sued Fawcett Comics, saying Captain Marvel was too similar to Superman, and won. Fawcett Comics then closed down shortly after in 1953, and Beck left the comic book industry, but continued doing commercial illustrations. By 1953, Beck relocated to Florida, where he owned the Ukulele Bar and Grill in Miami, Florida, where he also tended the bar. He contacted his friend Joe Simon and expressed he wanted to re-enter comic books, so they gave him work on the Silver Spider, and they pitched it to Harvey Comics, which they rejected. Throughout the years, he tried to re-enter comics, but with little success, until the 1970s, when DC, who now owned the rights to Captain Marvel, reintroduced Shazam into the DC continuity. He worked on Shazam issues 1 through 10, but then left due to creative differences. Throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, he would attend comic conventions and sell recreations of his Golden Age comic covers. He died in 1989 at the age of 79 of renal failure. Basil Wolverton. Notoriously known for his unforgettable depiction of wacky, grotesque, and ugly people, his style is often described as spaghetti and meatballs, which makes his style best suitable for comedy and horror. Born in 1909, he got his first published work at the age of 16 and began to pitch to different comic strips. By 1929, he got his first comic strip, Marco of Mars, accepted into Independent Syndicate of New York, but they never distributed it because it was too similar to Buck Rogers, which debuted around that same time that year. He continued to try and find work, even applying at Walt Disney Studios, but he was rejected. He found work in American comic books, with his first being Spacehawks, which appeared in Target Comics by Novelty Press. Also during this time, he found work at Centaur Publishing, which he worked on many comics for them throughout the early 1940s. He would draw a wide range from horror, sci-fi, but his breakout was humor. His first major success was Powerhouse Pepper, that first appeared in Joker Comics #1 in 1942. His highest claim to fame came in 1946, when there was an art contest. The popular comic strip Little Abner had a character deemed the ugliest woman in the world, but she would never appear in the comic strips, and was always drawn off screen. For marketing tactic, they had artists around the world draw what this character actually looked like. Over 500,000 readers sent in their drawings, even professional artists such as Carl Barks and Jack Cole, but none would top Wolverton's entry. His interpretation of Lena the Hyena won the first prize and was featured in Life magazine. Later, he would recreate the art for Mad magazine #11, where he would continue to do more work for Mad over the decades. From that point forward, he was mostly known and drew weird, grotesque characters. In 1974, he suffered a stroke, which brought an abrupt end to his career. He passed away 4 years later in 1978 at the age of 69. Matt Fox. Born in 1906, his birth records mistakenly identified him as Mars Fox. After completing 8th grade, he left school and joined the workforce as a laborer at a piano factory. In the evenings and weekends, Matt Fox would attend art classes at the National Academy of Design. In 1925, his father passed, so at the age of 19, he took a job as an iron worker to support his mother and sister. During the Great Depression, he looked to find a second job for extra income and became a commercial artist. His first published work appeared in 1940's pulp magazine Astonishing and Super Science Stories. He slowly became widely known for his covers on Weird Tales pulp. He was later drafted into the military for World War II, but 11 months later, honorably discharged due to physical disability he discovered during basic training. He returned to commercial work and selling painted covers to Weird Tales. He also got a job working for Marvel Comics, working on their sci-fi and horror comics such as Adventures into Terror, Journey into Mystery, Suspense. In 1952 through 1953, he did some illustrations for Chilling Comics, which was produced by Youthful Magazine. Throughout the early and mid-60s, he worked at Marvel on such titles as Tales to Astonish and Tales of Suspense. In 1966, he created his last known published work. He designed an ad for a mail-in monster glow-in-the-dark poster that he made. It appeared in Castle of Frankenstein 8 in October of 1966. He ended up not selling a single poster. 3 months after that, he applied for Social Security and retired from commercial art. He was notorious for never giving interviews and only made one public statement in Who's Who of American comics. He died in 1988 at the age of 81. Al Feldstein. Al Feldstein was a groundbreaking U.S. comic book editor and artist, and one of the mainstays of EC Comics. Born in 1925 in Brooklyn, New York, Albert Bernard Feldstein was the son of a Russian immigrant father and an American mother. He picked up drawing at an early age, encouraged by his mother and his elementary school teacher to pursue his artistic ambition. After winning an award in 1939's New York World's Fair Poster Contest, he decided on a career in the art field and studied at the High School of Music and Arts in Manhattan. After his education, he started working in the comic book industry as an apprentice at Jerry Iger's shop in 1941. He made $3 a week to do random chores around the studio and do some pencil cleanup work. Eventually, he got the opportunity to ink and draw some backgrounds on Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, featured in Fiction House. Later, he got the job working at Fox Comics, where he would write scripts and draw the stories. In 1948, he got a job at EC Comics, where his first comic book he worked on was Going Steady with Peggy. The title ended up being dropped before the first issue was ever published. He began to focus more on EC's horror and crime comics. In the beginning, he would just draw the art, but later he began to write the scripts and even do the editing. During his peak, Feldstein was writing 4 stories a week, as well as drawing the covers and at least one story inside the comic. Later, he backed away from drawing and mostly focused on editing and writing. He would save his art for doing covers only. In 1954, the Comics Code came out and all of EC's most popular titles got canceled. EC tried to pivot in a new direction, but their new comic line ended up only lasting a few issues. The one thing EC had that was selling very well was Mad Magazine. Feldstein left EC and tried his hand at freelancing again. He worked on Marvel's Yellow Claw by doing some script writing. In 1956, the editor of Mad Magazine, Henry Kurtzman, left EC and took most of the artists with him. EC asked if Feldstein would come be an editor of Mad Magazine. Feldstein remained at Mad Magazine for 29 years. At the time Feldstein took over Mad, it had a circulation of 350,000 magazines per issue. By 1974, Feldstein had brought that figure to 2.8 million per issue. He even started to get a share of the profits and became the highest paid editor in the world. After he retired from Mad Magazine in 1985, he began painting wildlife and even won some awards. He died in 2014 at the age of 88 in his home in Montana. Charles Biro. Charles Biro was born in New York in 1911. He studied art at both Brooklyn's Museum School of Art and Grand Central School of Art. After graduating, he was employed by Harry A. Chesler in 1936, where he would work as a writer and art supervisor until 1939, when he moved to MLJ Comics. There he worked as an artistic supervisor as well as a writer and artist until 1941. He created the character Steel Sterling and also worked on Sergeant Boyle before moving to Leave Gleason Publications. At Leave Gleason, he held the role of editorial director, head writer, and cover artist. He created The Little Wise Guys and also created Crime Buster and Crime Does Not Pay in 1942. His biggest contribution was the comic series Daredevil, where he would work on it through its entirety. Created long before Marvel's Daredevil, the Daredevil was rendered mute after seeing his father murdered. He was orphaned and became a boomerang marksman. By the 1940s, as superheroes started to fall out of fashion, Biro made the Little Wise Guys the main characters of the series, eventually kicking the superhero out of his comic book altogether by 1950. During this time, he created the first adult comic book in 1949, and it was called Tops. He left Leave Gleason in 1956, when his long-running Daredevil series had ended. He ended up leaving comic books altogether to work in television. He became a graphic designer for NBC up until his death in 1972 at the age of 60. These 10 comic book artists may have faded into obscurity over time, but their contribution to the industry is still felt today. Their unique styles and groundbreaking technique paved the way for comic book artists today, and they continue to inspire new and exciting work. While they may no longer be with us today, their legacy lives on through the pages of their work and the fans they inspired.